But one of the stories that this course tells is the birth of the American voice in poetry. And we saw how psalm singing and translation worked as this unifying force among the early colonists. Last week, we saw how Anne Bradstreet decorated her poetry with descriptions of the North American East Coast. That was new. We saw how Wigglesworth sought to safeguard the new colonies against backsliding into debauchery with his hit horror poem, The Day of Doom. And we also saw how Edward Taylor introduced a, a settler's voice into the devotional mode in his private verse meditations, which were not published. One of the questions that organizes this course is, where do we see among the constellation of American versifiers the birth of new lights, flashes of innovation and fresh colors signifying the beginnings whose influence touch us in the present through our own voices that are writing now? In Philip Freneau and Phillis Wheatley, in these two poets, we find the scintillating emergence of two distinct voices that are rooted in a very distinct American identity. And as America in the 18th century began to change from a place of religious refuge to a hub of commerce and political experimentation, so too did the poetry change. Philip Freneau was born in 1752. I have a picture of him here. But he's often considered the poet of the American Revolution. I'll show his portrait in a moment. His poetry and life both exhibit this conflicting trend in early American politics at this time. On one hand, you've got Freneau, who is really dedicated to public good, to the Commonwealth, but on the other hand, you have this very individualist ideal that focused on personal needs and individualism and a person's desires. And we were just talking before the meeting began, Jace was telling us about his Jeffersonianism, and part of that plays into the tensions within his verse and in his own political thought. But I think it's pretty reflective of the tensions within the emergence of the American identity as a national force. And his poetry really praises both. It has this reverence for the communal and this reverence for the individualistic character of the age. And Freneau believed that art should serve the republic. And poetry should be used in service to the nation. And this is not very different from what we saw last week or the 2 weeks before. In some ways, you'll find this similar to the Puritan ideal that inspired the Psalm translations, the ideal that language should serve truth, should not be decorated or ornate, but should be bare, plain, simple, and direct in order to service the church. And also resembles Michael Wigglesworth's notion that poetry should be put into service of theology. And so Freneau, like many Americans who came after him, conceived of poetry in the service of a national identity. And like many Americans today, he was a man of many jobs. At one point, he was a postal clerk. He served at one point as a newspaper editor and a ship's captain. His major poem, he has several of them. He's very prolific. One of the major poems, I should say, is The Rising Glory of America. It was penned by Freneau and had possibly some slight contributions from Hugh Henry Brackenbridge. But that's contested. It could have been written entirely by Freneau. The poem, The Rising Glory of America, was recited during the 1771 graduation from the College of New Jersey, which is now Princeton. So there are two versions of the poem that exist. One published before and one after the American Revolution. The one I want to look at today is the one that was delivered there at the graduation ceremony at Princeton in 1771. There's some minor differences. Although the impact of the poem was limited, it was very regional. The poem contributed to this developing sense of the American national identity. and it captures the nation's rising aspirations and potential, and it even casts some prophecy as well. Let me show you a picture for now. Here he is here. And so he was writing poetry as a student at Princeton. Now, I see in the comments too, the wild honeysuckle is mentioned, and that's another famous nature poem. Unfortunately, we're not looking at a nature poem, but this is really good. If you're new to Freneau, check out the wild honeysuckle, because in a lot of ways, it's going to give you some good context for the American transcendentalist tradition. So thanks for mentioning that, Jace, along with a few other poems I see there. Something to keep in mind. Now, this poem, The Rising Glory of America, was given to the graduating class, uh, Brackenbridge delivering it. It was first published in 1772 at Philadelphia in Joseph Cruikshank for R. Aitken, bookseller. So it was published the next year. And this was the same year when there was a committee of councils organized in the spring of 72 to help centralize an American response to the British bully tactics. So revolution's in the air, and this pamphlet edition is the only one extant of the original poem. Before we read it, I want you to imagine being a young man in the graduating audience of Princeton when this was recited. For the majority of those years, as an undergraduate, you would have been aware of the revolution brewing. Revolution had been blowing in the spring wind that year. British troops had been occupying Boston for much of their time. During your time at Princeton, at least since 1768, many fights had broken out into the streets. One clash between soldiers and a mob in 1770 left 5 dead, and the Americans called it the Boston Massacre, and the British called it the Incident on King Street. So it's kind of interesting what people do with language there. All the world's before you as a graduating undergraduate. The nation on the brink of war, revolutionary ideas circulating among the students and headmasters. It was just the kind of world for an 18th century young American to be in. The opportunity to play some part in the formation of a new society. And during the ceremony, you hear this encomium on America with these lines making this incredible promise. Here are the lines here, and these are the opening lines. No more of Memphis and her mighty kings, or Alexandria, where the Ptolemies taught golden commerce to unfurl her sails and bid fair science smile. No more of Greece, where learning next her early visit paid and spread her glories to illume the world. No more of Athens, where she flourished and saw her sons of mighty genius rise, smooth-flowing Plato, Socrates, and him who, with restless eloquence, revived the spirit of liberty and shook the thrones of Macedon and Persia's haughty king. No more of Rome, enlightened by her beams, fresh kindling there the fire of eloquence and poesy divine. Imperial Rome, whose wide dominion reached o'er half the globe, whose eagle flew o'er Ganges to the east, and in the west far to the British Isles. No more of Britain and her kings renowned, Edwards and Henry's thunderbolts of war, her chiefs victorious o'er the Gaelic foe. Illustrious senators, immortal bards, and wise philosophers, of these no more. A theme more new, though not less noble, claims our every thought on this auspicious day, the rising glory of this Western world, America. The rising glory of this Western world. It's very, it's effusive. You can feel the energy of the crowd that would have received it and how it was written with an eye to that, with an ear to that. And it's in the epic style, but not after the manner of Alexander Pope. Freneau is writing in mostly blank verse here. This is very interesting to me. Uh, I guess it's because of perhaps a Miltonic influence and the way the lines overflow, and he's getting into a mode of prophecy, as we'll see later in the poem with this next excerpt. Possibly, that's my speculation there. But Freneau is writing in these lines of blank verse, which, if you don't know, are unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter. Each line has 10 syllables, 5 of them stressed in an alternating pattern of unstressed, stressed. And this is the mode that Milton wrote in. Let me skip down several lines to show you how these personae in the poem, spoken by personae in the poem, speak of a prophecy of American literature. This is Acosto speaking. "'Tis but the morning of the world with us, and science yet but sheds her orient rays. Science meant knowledge. I see the age, the happy age, roll on, bright with the splendors of her midday beams. I see a Homer and a Milton rise in all the pomp and majesty of song, which gives immortal vigor to the deeds achieved by heroes in the fields of fame. A second Pope, like that Arabian bird of which no age can boast but one, may yet awake the muse by Schuylkill's silent stream, and bid new forests bloom along her tide." It's Alexander Pope. Of course, we know Homer, John Milton, Homer of Greece, Milton of England, Pope of the Augustan England. But these are Pennsylvania features of the landscape, rivers and streams. And Susquehanna's rocky stream unsung in bright meanders winding round the hills, where first the mountain nymph, sweet Echo, heard the uncouth music of my rural lay, shall yet remurmur to the magic sound of song heroic, when in future days some noble Hampden rises to the fame. He's imagining America bringing forth poets as what Homer was to Greece, what Milton and Pope were to England. So America too shall have these. And then Leander joins in. All Roanoke's and James's limpid waves, the sound of music murmurs in the gale. Another Denham, a poet, celebrates their flow in gliding numbers and harmonious lays. Just as Thomas Gray, in his elegy written in a country churchyard, imagined that some mute and glorious Milton might be resting at the churchyard of Stoke Poges, so Freneau guessed that some future Homer, Milton, or Alexander Pope might rise up in future years, or perhaps from the audience of his own graduating class. It's important because, well, for a number of reasons, this is worth noting. It's going to help us in the lectures to come, but it's also engaging in this act of prophecy, very different from the Jeremiad. It's almost a messianic form of prophecy of one who is coming. And we'll see Margaret Fuller and Ralph Waldo Emerson and his essay, The Poet, take up this kind of prophecy as well. It doesn't decry sin like the Jeremiad, but it predicts coming prosperity, coming of a person or of figures. And what's more important, this is going to come up within the first few meetings of the Transcendentalist course in the fall. So now most of Freneau's poetry was rhymed. What I've given you isn't exactly the greatest representation of his style. It was rhymed. It was not very inventive. It wasn't very innovative. He was not that American poet, and I think he knew that he wasn't the Homer or Milton to come. I think he was not idiosyncratic, and he didn't want to be. He performed what was expected of the social role of the poet, according to the 18th century's expectations. But his poetry is very accessible, written not just to the most educated, but to anyone who could read. His poetry could be public-facing, just as what we've seen with this panegyric on the nation, but it could also be private. And if you want some good examples of that, his poems of fancy are a good example of his private mode of verse. It can be very introspective and thoughtful. But now let me introduce you to Phillis Wheatley. Wheatley's only book. This is the etching that was placed in her only book, her first and only book published in 1773, poems on various subjects, religious and moral. This was probably, the scholars believe, this likeness was drawn by Scipio Moorhead, who is the SM addressed by Wheatley in one of the poems to SM, a young African painter. He was a Bostonian painter. He was also African American. And so her poems are also drawing in, tapping into this culture emerging in America that's not white. It's African American. And even though many of the figures, the African American figures in Boston at this time, were enslaved people, and so was Phillis Wheatley. Her poems were published through subscription. She actually began, she was very precocious at the age of 9. She was reciting long passages from the Bible. She was publishing her own poetry later in years, occasional verse in newspapers. And then she brought forth this book. And this book includes a signed attestation of her authorship from her master and several notable Bostonians, such as Thomas Hutchinson and John Hancock. It is unfortunate that she needed these signatures because they preempt the fact that there would be objections against her authorship. And Wheatley's work had to find validation in a predominantly male, white literary world. And they did. They were enormously successful. She modeled her work on the established forms and styles established by Pope. So she was influenced by Alexander Pope, who, of course, is a big figure in transatlantic literature at this time. This collection is mostly composed of epidictic poetry, poetry of praise and commemoration, but her poems also were dedicated to the deceased in honoring great figures such as George Washington. So if in Freneau we saw this paradox or this tension in the way that he sometimes praises the Commonwealth and sometimes the Republic, Phillis Wheatley presents a further set of tensions or even paradoxes. She's the most significant African-American poet of her time. She was set apart from her white male literary world in which she found fame, yet her poetry showed a mastery of their style. It's hard to think of this in terms of a national idea of individualism because she wasn't exactly an individualist. She basically could not have been because she remained an enslaved person. She literally belonged to John Wheatley, a Boston merchant. And John's wife, Susanna, taught young Phillis to read and write not long after she was purchased in 1761. So don't suspect that because of this, she had an underdeveloped sense of self. She had a keen sense of her own identity, both as an enslaved person and as a poet. And this is what's remarkable about her poetry. She also saw poetry as a potential source of income and self-sufficiency, as a means of establishing her own autonomy. She turned her blackness and her enslaved condition into an affirmation of her singularity. She doesn't put it aside and ask readers to ignore it. She brings attention to it. And in many of her poems, call attention to her African origin with a sense of racial pride. And that's something to be noted. I want to read a difficult poem. It's difficult because it's complex. It's her most famous poem, I think, at this time in history, On Being Brought from Africa. This offers insight into the complexities of her state in America. Let me just pull that up here. "'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, and there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined, and join the angelic train. Obviously, it's complex because of these lines here. She is in some ways grateful for having been brought from Africa. And this is difficult. So the early 20th century critics of Black American literature were not very kind to Wheatley because of her lack of concern for slavery, which I think is a specious lack of concern. She's very concerned with it. Think about what she's doing in these lines. She's actually doing a lot here. It's complex because in it, she expresses gratitude for the spiritual enlightenment that her enslavement brought. But at the same time, she chides those who say that Africans are of a diabolic dye, are of the devil, saying that the darkness of their skin indicated some spiritual condition. And I know that her gratitude here for the slavery is complex, somewhat uncomfortable, and its genuineness can be contested. But notice the power and strength of these last lines. She calls upon the Christians remember that Africans are included in the church, and is upon the grounds of spiritual equality where the poem comes to rest here at the end in this final couplet. And this is a very Popian, heroic verse, except for the enjambment there. She's a master of this style. It identifies the terms of spiritual equity. For if the spiritual world contained higher truths than the physical, and if the physical world were to be regulated by the spiritual, which is what the Puritans and the religious culture of America was affirming, then the majority of white Christians in America had got it wrong in thinking that their color is a diabolical dye. And she's subtly in this Jeremiah mode here, which we're going to see in the fall when we come to read Frederick Douglass, a former enslaved person who writes his own story and also writes in the Jeremiah mode. We're going to be reading What to the Slave is the 4th of July, often called the Oration by Douglass. Definitely in the Jeremiah mode. But here, Wheatley is using it too, I think. And you'll remember the speaker of the Jeremiah mode decries political and social corruption. So something to keep in mind. It's complex, and we should explore the complexities there. But we should also keep in mind of how gutsy this was, and the power that's in those final lines. Now, she was a champion of Black worth and engaged in with this white male political superstructure in its own genre, in the mode of the elite refined poets. And that's pretty cool. She became a cultural icon even before her death within the discourse of abolition movement and the controversy over slavery. So readers, Black and white, have defended her poetry. She, in her book, calls to other Black writers like S.M., Jupiter Hammond, who, by the way, is the first African-American poet to publish a poem. Wheatley is the first to publish a book of poems. Hammond also is addressing Wheatley. And so even in this emerging Black or African-American literature, we see the network being plotted. And we see that this is a tradition emerging. So in the African-American literature, she was a forerunner who legitimized Black literacy and encouraged others to write. She was one of them. And she wrote many excellent poems, some of which we'll be reading in the group activities in just a moment. I do want to say that with Wheatley, it's important to remark that we read her today not just because her circumstance was a rarity, but because she wrote excellent poetry, as well as being circumstantially unique in her race and in her ability. Her international reputation was greater than that of Philip Freneau or of any American poet before William Cullen Bryant, who was the great American poet right before Whitman and after the poetry of the Revolution. That's significant. She does have two poems which are in blank verse. On Virtue, and the poem addressed to Harvard called To the University of Cambridge in New England. Those poems deviate from traditional rhyme scheme, but and they utilize blank verse, as we saw Philip Freneau doing as well. So I hope this gives some insight into these two poets. And I want to introduce our discussion exercise here. Pull this up. We're going to do the same thing we've been doing, 3 groups. Group 1 is going to consider Freneau's style in the American Independent. This is written after the Revolutionary War. We read one that was anticipating it and the rising glory of America. Now America Independent will be a kind of epic poem that celebrates that. And I want us to consider what the poem invents that's new, striking, or memorable. You have some prompts here, but think about it and discuss among yourselves. You might want to deviate from some of these questions. You might want to think, what's striking to you about the poem? What stands out here? But we'll have 15 minutes to 20 minutes to discuss. Again, read the poem aloud. I just have an excerpt of it, the opening lines, and then choose a volunteer to act as spokesperson when we get back, and we'll all discuss that poem together. And the last 2 groups, groups 2 and 3, are focusing on Wheatley's poems. An excerpt from On the Imagination. The imagination was a huge topic in Britain in the 18th century. You had Mark Akenside, David Hartley, John Locke, Alexander Pope to some extent, all writing about the imagination as a uniquely human faculty. I want us to think too about, what do you notice about this excerpt? How is the imagination described? What is the form of the poem? Why is that significant? And what might be the personal importance to Wheatley for extolling the imagination? And the last hymn is a beautiful hymn, a hymn to the evening. Group 3 is going to read this one aloud, and I have the entire poem there because it's short, and we can all read it and discuss it within 20 minutes. Think the same thing. What strikes you about the poem? How does it begin? What turns does it make? What journey does the poem make to get to its end? The poem is about the evening, but what else might it be about? We're thinking about this in context of this period of the 18th century. So for everyone on YouTube, thanks for watching, and now we're going to begin the discussion.